instructions, laws, wisdom. And today we're going to get into something that has to do with the Israelite relationship with other nations, which could be disturbing, but I think will actually lead to sort of some great illumination for us. That's the hope, at least. Okay, so we're going to screen share. Did we print out the sources?
All the way. You can use the screen.
Okay, so right. So you're going to screen share or should I? Okay. All right, so I'm going to get out of this in that case.
Somebody here for the first time?
In the room or in the? Oh, first time in the room.
In the room.
You're the first time in the room, remember?
No, I've never been here for
No.
Never? Goodness.
Okay, so this.
Who's our moderator today?
Anna.
Anna.
Hey, Rabbi.
We're just gonna, don't worry, it'll be recorded here.
I'm not recording. I just want to take over. You can
No, you can't, it'll be recorded, so you don't have to worry. Hi, Anna, can you just let me in? Great. Also, just let me be a moderator if that's, or a co-host. Is that cool?
Yep, that'll work. You can share screen either way.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna.
Okay, great. You're going to have
Everything
a paper source sheet in there. I know it looks small.
sip, sip, sip.
Soaking.
Sipping, soaking, soaking, soaking.
Slipping.
Sipping away.
That's good. Sipping away, Paul said. So remember, okay. In the room, remember to, when you're participating, to speak loudly, because that way people on Zoom can hear you. Okay, did you want me to start? Okay. So we're in Deuteronomy, and as we said, Ki Tetzeh. And verse 4 in chapter 23 says, Lo yavo Amoni Moavi b'kehal Adonai gam dor asiri lo yavo lahem b'kehal Adonai ad olam. So no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of Adonai. No descendants of such, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of Adonai. So there's this two groups of people, the Ammonites and the Moabites. So let me just remark that in Genesis, there is a background where Abraham's nephew, after the destruction of the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, they escape from Sodom and Gomorrah and they go to this small place. And his daughters think, Lot's daughters think there's no man left on this earth, and they decide to get their father drunk and sleep with him. And their two sons are Ammon and Moab. So they're born
One of those fun biblical stories. Yeah.
born of an incestuous union, which is forbidden by the Torah. Okay, so that's not what's mentioned here, though. Let's see the reason for no Ammonite or Moabite being admitted into the congregation of Adonai is given in verse 5, and it is Al devar asher lo kiblu etchem balechem uvamayim, because they did not meet you with food and water, b'derech seitchem mitzrayim, on your journey out of, or on your journey leaving Egypt, ba'asher sachar alecha es bilcham, and because you rented this guy, this sort of prophet at large, not an Israelite, a non-Israelite prophet, and rented this guy Bilham ben Beor Vitor Aram Naharaim Le Ka Le Lecha to curse you. So two reasons are they weren't good hosts, right? They didn't give them food and water. And because they rented this prophet to curse the Israelites. Okay, so the background perhaps is this incestuous union, perhaps. And the foreground here is the not sort of extending food and water bread and water to the vulnerable Israelites who left Egypt. Okay, and getting in the way by hiring this guy to curse. Okay. All right, so that's really interesting because the next thing we have is the book of Ruth. Well, not the next thing we have on the page is the book of Ruth to show you that Ruth is an example of a Moabite, or actually the only example of a Moabite, who has entered the kingdom of Adonai. So what's the story of Ruth? And not only does Ruth enter the community, the assembly of Adonai, but Ruth ultimately is the foremother of the Davidic genealogy from which comes the Messiah, right? The Davidic dynasty from which ultimately is said to come the Messiah. Do you want to read?
Sure. So, Vayhi Shot HaShoftim Vayhi Ra'av Ba'aretz. This is the beginning of chapter 1 in the book of Ruth. And there's a Ra'av, there's a famine in the land in the time of the judges. Vayelech Ish Ben Beit Lechem. There's a certain man from the town of the House of Bread. Kind of interesting just to see that there was a Ra'av, there was a famine, but there's a man in the House of Bread, or Beit Lechem literally means the house of bread, or the home of bread, bread house. And it's Mi Beit Lechem Yehuda. So it's already in the presaging of the first verse of the book of Ruth, a connection with Judah. Yehuda, of course, it means in the territory of Judah, but Judah, of course, is the most important, thematically, the most important biblical person when it comes to the Davidic dynasty, right? Because Judah was the fourth, but then became the fourth child of Leah, the fourth child in general of Jacob, but becomes the leader of the brothers and becomes, of course, the Malchut, the monarchy on this weekend of monarchy is in Judah, and Judah is the place, the source of all of the kings of Israel. So this story tells us that there's a famine, there's a lack in the land, and a certain person from the town called Bread Town, who's in the tribe or in the tribal territory of Judah, goes to stay in the fields of Moab, which is already fascinating, right? Goes to this fields of Moab, given what we just read in source number 1, right, about the enmity between the Israelites and the Moabites. But he goes to live in that Moabite town, he, his wife, and his 2 sons. And verse 2 says, V'shem ha'ish Elimelech, so the man's name is Elimelech, God is my king. V'shem ishto, and his wife's name Naami, right? V'shem, or my pleasantness. V'shem b'nei shnei ba'anav machlon v'chadyon, as Reb Zalman, my beloved teacher of blessed memory, used to call sickly. The kid's name is Sickly, and what's another, like a stomach virus.
My teacher, Ed Greenstein, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, used to call them Sicky and Deddy.
Sicky and Deddy. Right, exactly. Like Sicky and Desolation. It's like the names are like almost like Native American names. Names in the Bible often are meaningful, right? They tell a story. The name will tell a story, not just be a signifier. So we have these names, and they're from Ephraim, right? And right. So it tells us they're from Ephraim, but from Beit Lechem Yehuda repeats it again. It repeats it, and the most important piece, though, is they come to the fields of Moab and they live there. And in verse 3, Vayamat Elimelech ish Naami. And so verse 3 tells us that Elimelech dies. Naami's husband dies. She's now a widower. But she's a widow, and and she stays alone. She's alone with her 2 sons. And verse 4 should knock your socks off if you read Deuteronomy, the first verse that we read this morning, right? Moabites. We're not allowed to be with Moabites, but verse 4 tells us very clearly, and they married women, these 2 sons of Elimelech who just passed away. Naomi marries them off to 2 Moabite wives. The first one's name is Oprah, Winfrey, not Orpah. Orpah is her name, Orpah, right? And that's actually Oprah was named Orpah, but then nobody can say Orpah, so they named her Oprah. So Shem Hashenit, Ruth, right? Bum, 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 the heroine arrives. The second one is called Ruth. Vayeshvu sham ke'eser shanim, and they stay there around 10 years. Now,
And then they died too.
and then the two sons die, right? And the story continues. The two sons die, and if you know the story, Ruth and her sister, quote unquote, in marriage, Orpah leave with Naomi to go back to the land of Israel, right? And because now there's food there, and Naomi says, Orpah, you stay here, stay, don't come with me. And to Ruth also, don't come with me. And Orpah does leave, but Ruth refuses to leave her mother-in-law, and she comes back to the land of Israel. And in the land of Israel, right, she is dealt with in great kindness by someone named Boaz. And Boaz and Ruth, they get together, they marry, and they have children. So source number 3 will tell us at the very end of the book of Ruth, and it will tell us essentially that this entire book was written in order to tell us about who comes from Ruth. Ruth was very powerful, but also who comes from Ruth. It's a story of great generosity, of great kindness. It's also a story that, again, in the context of Deuteronomy, should never have happened, right? In the context of Deuteronomy, it should never have happened. But not only does it happen, as Rabbi Koloresa said, but also not only is it like remarkable that it happens, but great things come from it, like the greatest things. So verses 13 through 22 will tell us, Vayikach Boaz et Ruth, Vatihilo Lishai, and Boaz takes Ruth as his wife, and she becomes, right, and Vayavoila, Vayitain la herayon, Vayitain la herayon, God, right, she becomes pregnant, Vatele ben, she has a son. Vatomarna nashim el nami baruch Adonai, shelo ishbit lach goel hayom vayikra shmo Yisrael. Yikari shmo Yisrael. So the women who are also part of this story, like the women in the chorus, they're like, all the women said to Naomi, look, Baruch Hashem, thank God that you have a goel, like you have like something came out of you, right? That you have a continuation of your line. Goel is a very particular term. And let his name be called Yisrael. Right, all these verses, okay, beautiful verses, right? And Naomi takes the child. Okay, all of this is really not the point. Here's the point. They name him Oved in verse 17. V'hu avi Yishai avi David. Oved is the name of the child born from the illicit and deuteronomically prohibited relationship between Ruth, right? Between Ruth and Boaz. And Ruth, of course, had already, right? Ruth should not have married anybody, but Ruth marries Boaz, and Boaz and Ruth have a child, and his name becomes Oved. And Oved is the grandfather of King David. And then verse 18, 19, 21, and 22, 20, 22 tell us the lineage, right? All the way back to Peretz. Peretz, who is the son of the illicit relation between Judah and Tamar in chapter 38 of the book of Genesis. Judah and Tamar should never have gotten married either. And Judah and Tamar takes matters into her own hands. She and Judah have twins, Peretz and Zerach. And here the lineage in the end of the book of Ruth will tell us, right, there's no way, right, this is kosher. It goes all the way back. Peretz, Chetzron gives birth to Ram. Ram gives birth to Aminadab. Aminadab gives birth to Nachshon. Nachshon gives birth to Salma. Salma and Salmon gives birth to Boaz. Boaz gives birth to Oved. And Oved is giving birth to Jesse, Yishai, and Yishai, Holid, et David. For a moment, we're going to bracket the fact that Ruth is not mentioned here, even though the book is named after her, right? In a patrilineal culture, that's what happens, unfortunately. But we never lost Ruth's name. And it's vital that she's the woman through which redemption comes. But it leaves us at the end of these three sources with a very, very big question. And that is, what is going on? This is not kosher. Like no matter how many lineages that they, what do you do with Deuteronomy?
What do you do with Ruth?
Right?
Right, what do you do
What does
with
Ruth do? What does Ruth do with Deuteronomy? And what does Deuteronomy do with
Right.
Ruth? Like, what do you do with a text like Deuteronomy? Like, what do you do? And it's like, and Ruth, it's like a little bit out of control. Like at the end of Ruth, we should be all scratching our heads and going, that's a little bit weird. Is it like Reform Judaism in the Bible? Like it's like, oh, that was then, this is now. There's something deeply troubling about the way that these two texts are in conversation with one another. There's a big stira, there's a contradiction.
Also, it's not very forgiving, the whole situation that the converts are not accepted until the third generation.
No,
10th.
no,
Depends who.
no. Converts are not in the. They're not even allowed in the Kehillah. Look back at source number 1.
Right.
But could you read it that the 11th generation is okay?
Could Ruth have been?
It says Gam. It doesn't say Ad. It says Gam Dor Hasiri. Even the 10th generation are not allowed in Ad Olam forever. And so, just to give some more context to what.
But it's confusing why they mention the 10th.
Why do they? Right. Because you might have thought. Because in other contexts, because in the context of the other verses that are in this week's parsha. By the way, this is, as Rabbi told us, just to remind you, this is not the only inclusion-exclusion prohibition in the Torah in this week's portion, right? So there are, right, if you are an Adamite, right, you're allowed into the community and if you're an Egyptian, after the third generation. And so there are other nations that were the arch enemies of the Jewish people that are forgiven, but something about Ammon and Moab are not forgiven in the Deuteronomic text.
Something about them that's essentially not
essentially,
forgiven.
right, like something like. And the Torah tells us, by the way, because they didn't bring us water and bread. But like just to feel the tension here, because clearly what the Bible prohibits is not what the Jews lived in the book of Ruth. And it becomes codified and becomes a part of our tradition, right? Becomes a part of the tradition. So it's not even true that the converts could come into, that's like, in this case, it's really bad. So just sit with that tension for a moment because you're not the only ones who felt tension around it, right? So in the 2nd century, the rabbis decided to say something about how they ameliorate these things, how they harmonize it. So source number 4 will bring us there.
Can I ask you a question? And
Sure.
it kind of relates to this, but I've always been confused, like if the mother's Jewish, the child is Jewish. And then I hear there's another thing, like if the father's Jewish, the child is Jewish.
So we're gonna stay a little bit off of patrilineality and matrilineality. It depends on both of those traditions are in the Bible. There is a patrilineal lineage and there's also a matrilineal lineage. And according to Jewish law, as defined by the Orthodox until the 20th century, it was the status of a child was dependent upon the mother. But in the Reform movement, they made a decision that the father also has an impact on the Jewish status of a child as well. So patrilineal
depends on the Jewish community. So both are true depending on where you go.
Right. So let's move into the Mishnah, and then we'll see what the rabbis. I'm really curious about you. I'm curious to hear what you guys will think when you hear how the rabbis work with this contradiction.
Okay, so Mishnah Yevamot. Ammoni, Moabi, Asurim. So Ammonite and Moabite converts, let's say, are prohibited. In other words, they can't enter into the community of Israel. The Isurim, Isur Olam, it's forever. Aval Nikavotehem Mutarot Miyad. So the men are prohibited, but the females, the women, are allowed, are permitted. Okay. So right there solves the book of Ruth, right? Solves the contradiction. So the rabbis are wrestling with the contradiction, but it's like, oh, it must be about men, not women. That's what Deuteronomy must be referring to. And then it says, Mitzri v'adomi einam asurim ela ad shlosha dorot. So Egyptians and Edomites are not prohibited except for the first 3 generations. chad zkarim, ve'echad nekevot. So that's for both males and females. And Rabbi Shimon matir et hanekevot miyad. Rabbi Shimon says right away the women are permitted. You don't have to wait 3 generations. Okay, so you see how they do this sort of logical move, and it's okay. You know, Ruth was okay. Was there anything else?
Yeah, but of course we don't know where they got that from, right? That's the Mishnah. But just listen first. So we don't yet know. So we have to wait. And by the way, we're not the only ones, because the rabbis apparently made this decision. There's a halachic decision, and the rabbis of the Talmud who lived after the time of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is source number 4, but in source number 5, the rabbis in the Babylonian period were reading the legal tractate that we just read, the treatise of the Mishnah, are wondering, like, where do they get that from? Like, that's not in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say Ammonite or Moabite women are permitted and only the men are prohibited. Now, just so
But it
you can
makes sense. If you look at the contradiction, it's one way to resolve the contradiction logically.
right. Oh, so in other words, okay, great. That's good. So if you look at Ruth and you say, and you want to retroactively understand what might be happening in the book of Ruth, you might say, oh, clearly the rabbi, the authority of the time had some oral tradition that women were somehow excluded from the prohibition, and that's why Ruth could marry in. That's one.
If you assume there are no contradictions in the Talmud.
Right. If you
That's what
assume,
you're gonna
exactly. If you assume that there's no contradiction. Now, the rabbis of the Talmud are going to want to know what the textual permissibility, like, where did they get that from? Those authorities who were living at the time of Ruth, like, how might they have read the book of Deuteronomy? Again, assuming the book of Deuteronomy is authoritative, and assuming that people were living by it, we could also assume that they weren't living by it, but the rabbis of the Talmud are not going to make that assumption. They're going to try to ameliorate this, try to figure it out. Now, just to allay any concerns before we go any further, none of these prohibitions are still in place. So everybody's like, wow, this is really like not my values, like it's not nice, it's not fair.
Right.
Just so you know that certainly from the Talmudic period on, the assumption was that we don't actually know where people come from, and that if a person comes before you and they want to be Jewish or do Jewish or be a part of the community, you are to treat them with great respect. And right, so it's really clear from the Talmudic period all the way forward, right, including Amalek, the quote unquote arch enemy of the Jewish people, right? So we don't have the right to say, oh, this person is an Amalekite or a Moabite or Ammonite. And again, just so you can relax a little bit, right? But there's something in this story that we think is quite relevant for Tshuva and for this time of the year and for just the way that we work with this piece. So just hold on for a second with your assumption questions. Yeah, Alina.
It's still male dominant. Males can have any woman. The woman couldn't have any man. So still the men could get, the woman is fair game. I just feel like it's still based on that same.
You mean the Israelite men can have the women? Right, but the Israelite women can't have a Moabite, Ammonite men.
What about all those Ammonite men? J dates. Like I can't. Ammonites, Moabites. It's like a whole playing field. It's like I came to Rome because I heard there were Ammonites here and Moabites, and it's just like it's hard to find a good Moabite man. And then no.
I heard something, I don't know if it has any weight at all, that it goes by the woman because the child came out of the woman, so this is a Jewish child. Does that have anything to do with any teaching?
Yes. Yeah. Depending on the community you're in. And so I think that let me take a step back here and say that we're hoping the next half hour or so that we're not actually, the texts that we brought are actually, although they are inviting a conversation about Jewish identity and about who's in and who's out, it's really a broader conversation about transformation and how we work with what we inherit, right?
And the nature of Torah
and the nature of Torah itself and the nature of our, so it's both local to the Jewish tradition and it's local to conversations about identity. But as you'll see in this moment, in the next moment, in the next text, that it's actually there's something else happening here that's quite instructive and potentially transformational. So let's actually let the text speak and then we'll come back. So source number 5 is the Talmudic conversation about the Mishnah. Right? The Mishnah had said only, right, the prohibition is only about the men, but women are allowed. So the rabbis of the Talmud say like this: Kitanae, Amoni, v'lo Amonit, Moavi, v'lo Moaviyat, Moavit. The Rabbi Yehuda. There are 2 reasons given in the Talmud for the Mishnaic postulate. Only men were included in the prohibition, but not women. So one rabbi of the Tannaitic period, circa the 2nd century of the Common Era, writes, it's a textual anomaly that allows us to say that it's only the men, because it says who are prohibited from coming into the community, Ammoni, right? And Ammoni or a Moavi, but it could have said Ammonit or Moavit. So this rabbi says from this, right, very precise masculine gendered, right, it's only the Moabite, right, who is a man in Hebrew, Moavi or Ammoni, the Ammonite. I'm deducing that it's only the men and not the women. That was Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Shimon says, no. Rabbi Shimon says, I'm not trusting your, or I disagree with your textual, your textual diuk, your precise reading of this text. I say it's because the Bible already gave us the reason for the prohibition. The Bible gives us the reason. The reason why they're prohibited is because they didn't bring forth bread and water. They didn't offer that kindness. And who brings out bread and water? Who are the ones who go out into the battlefields? He says, men. That's what he says. Men are the ones. And so since men were the ones who did it, right? Right. The front, since the men were not the ones who, it wasn't the way of the women are back or in that period or in the home, whatever it might be. So they can't be blamed for the sins of the men. The men were the ones who should have brought the bread and the water, says Rabbi Shimon. So why we wouldn't include the women in this prohibition? The women would have been kind, right? Now, that's the beginning of the Talmud. So that's the Talmudic disagreement about how do we source this clear practice that women who were Moabites were marrying men, including Ruth, who married Boaz and married, right, the children of Elimelech and Naomi.
They also say, it's not here, that men would hire a prophet to curse Israel, but women wouldn't be doing that.
Right. That's not
Right? So it's like an assumption
about
about men in the public sphere, I think.
Right. But it's a beautiful assumption here in the part about not, right, the ones who should be punished, not the ones who shouldn't be, right? If the Torah tells us the reason for that, we're not going to include the women in this because it wasn't their fault, right? Now, from this strange conversation about how do we defend a practice where women were marrying, where Moabite women were marrying into the Jewish community, this interesting extension, the rabbis' attempts, and however forced they are, but their deep desire to find a way to allow this more inclusive practice that clearly, was there. It's kind of a remarkable moment, rabbinically speaking, for them to make every attempt possible to justify and to ground it and to validate it.
Well, they also have to legitimize David. I mean, David was a very problematic figure. So I think there's like 2 impulses here,
right? Which
is resolving the contradiction of the Torah and legitimizing the Davidic dynasty.
Right. And King David, certainly in the minds of the rabbis and certainly in the minds of Jewish history, King David was the greatest king in Israel. And like the future messianic, political and spiritual, right, redemptive figure will be from King David's house. And so, there's something profound. The rabbis actually are in later tradition, which we're not going to bring here. Later tradition actually see this as part of like there's a reason for it. Like King David must come from the outside so that he will bring others who are on the outside inside. So he has to know in his own being what it was to feel like an outsider. And then the rabbis try to find a way for him to legitimate his status. And in the very next moment of the Talmud, which is deeply full of pathos, the Talmud imagines King David feeling completely inhibited and bound. The word in Moserai, the word Moser means something is like completely, he's chained. He says, like the rabbis, the Rash Rava still in source number 5 where it says, and Rava taught, right? Rava taught towards the bottom. What is the meaning of the verse in Psalm 116 that we sing whenever we celebrate a holiday? We sing this verse, Pitachta lemoserai, you opened my mosarai, the things that had tied me down or that limited me. What does it mean? So the rabbis imagine Amar David that King David sang to God, the Holy One of Blessing, Master of the world. There are two, right? There are two moserot. There are two, chains, bands that I've been bound by, and you open them. The one was that my mother Ruth, my great grandmother Ruth Hamaviyav and Naamah Ammonit, right? That's what it means. That you, right? You God opened up, and really it's like the rabbis. It's kind of funny that it says he's thanking God, but really he's thanking the rabbis for opening up this way for me to feel legitimately like I'm a part of the Jewish people, I'm a part of this community, and that I'm not on the outside. So that the rabbis make every effort to find a way to welcome King David David into the fold, and to give him a sense of he belongs, that he's one of us. Now, it was clearly on his mind, like he was completely, and people would make fun of him. You'll see in the next source that the King David, he was completely mocked. Like there were people who thought that he wasn't a legitimate, that the election wasn't real.
So he has Ruth.
They just felt like, he wasn't real.
He's Ruth behind him in terms of lineage, and then he's Naamah, whose son Shlomo, Solomon married, who's an Ammonite, right? So, both going and coming, he's got this problem with Moabites and Ammonites.
And before we take some questions here, we'll take some comments, then we'll go to the last source about King David's neurosis around this. But what's really remarkable in this text is that in the Parsha, there seems to be no forgiveness for the Ammonites and for the Moabites. And the rabbis are not okay with that. Or let's put it this way. The Jewish people were not okay with that in the book of Ruth. Before we get to the rabbis, the Jewish people in the book of Ruth are like, oh, really? Yeah, but I just found it sounds a lot like what happens today, right? It's like, oh, but I met her at Penn. She's amazing. What? We can't find a way for her to be a part of this community. We can't find a way for us to open up our doors. Or I know that the Torah has a grudge against the Ammonites and the Moabites.
And Ruth becomes the model for conversion, which is really interesting.
It's so amazing.
It's Ruth becomes a model for entering the Jewish community.
And so Ruth becomes this model for entering the Jewish community. It begins with just to further deepen this theme, the Torah seems to be saying that the Ammonites and Moabites were guilty of not bringing bread and water. That's their sin. You'll see also another source here that they weren't. But the story in Ruth turns it on its head because in the land of Israel, they come from a place called Beit Lechem, the house of bread, but there's no bread there. And so they go to Moab where there is bread.
But
and they're in Moab.
One of the greatest sins of Sodom and
Gomorrah was
that
they weren't
they didn't
hospitable.
Right.
So in the book of Ruth, which is a story that becomes canonical for our tradition, and for thousands of years across the globe, Jews have been reading that story about how a woman who's in the land of the unkind land, does a kindness for this family, then marries into the family, and then comes back, and then Boaz feeds her, her eventual husband feeds her because she's hungry and she's at the field, and he feeds her. And this nourishment and this feeding, and it becomes a kind of.
She brings it back to Naomi.
And then she brings it back to Naomi, and she feeds Naomi. And it's as if intertextually and intratextually in our tradition, there's a struggle with the belief that you can ossify a person, a community, or a people at one point in their history, notwithstanding that Amalek in this Torah, we end this portion with Amalek, right, who, by the way, are allowed to marry and to convert. The Torah, the Torah's own grudge becomes historically and then rabbinically healed, right? And even though the rabbis say you can't marry the men, right? Okay.
There's something about her kindness that's powerful enough to avert destiny. By destiny is laid out in Deuteronomy,
And she, as you know, Kim Schneiderman has these writing workshops, woman member, she steps out of her story. She steps out of the Moabite story through love and kindness and care and attachment to Naomi.
And she writes her own story. So her
Ruth.
story becomes our story after she steps out of the earlier story.
She rewrites Jewish history.
She completely
by
rewrites
stepping
history.
out of her story, which is so appropriate to talk about at this moment.
Totally.
What's tshuva except for, not being ossified in your habitual story, your habitual habit.
And then the rabbis do something remarkable, of course, which is not only does Ruth change history, but King David and the entire messianic redemptive moment, whatever you understand redemption to be, messianically speaking, is it a person, is it an epoch, is it a raising of consciousness? All of it is predicated on the ability to change a story, or to change the story that you received and inherited. And in that way, it becomes, the book of Ruth is so remarkably transgressive. And here, transgression, ironically, becomes the source of tshuva. It's like the paradox of tshuva. When we often think about repentance, we think about making amends, or, I violated a principle, whatever it be. But of course, all tshuva is itself a violation of a certain principle. Like the principle that what was has to be, or the way I was is the way that I have to be, or the way that the story was given is the way that I have to also bring it forward. Like change itself that tshuva is predicated on is by definition a holy transgression.
Right. It's all about connection between the past and the present and the future. The other irony here is Elimelech, the husband of Naomi. The rabbis say he actually didn't help. He was a resources. He didn't help people out during a famine in the house of bread, and then he leaves and goes to Moab. Right. So Ruth becomes sort of a balat chesed, like a person of chesed, in the way that Naomi's husband, the Israelite, was not. Right. So this whole story, all of this turns on whether you're generous with your food and your water. It's like a very concrete thing.
Very concrete.
What do you do with your resources? How are you living out, right, your resources on this earth today?
We have a couple hands up in the room, and then we're going to go to the Zoom. So from the room to the Zoom. So behind me, and then I can't see. We can't see behind us. So Paul.
I am hearing what you're saying, and in my mind, I am thinking that what the rabbis are doing are arranging angels on the head of a pin. And the underlying issue is whether Judaism is a culture or is it a race. And the Torah has both. And we want Judaism to be a culture. And lots of other Jews want Judaism to be a race.
A culture? We want Judaism to be a culture?
We want
a civilization, like a
Because I don't like
ethnicity.
Race meaning a genetic relationship to one another. Cultural as opposed to practice, how we comport ourselves as Jews. It's my feeling that in the Romemu community, it's a much greater emphasis on how we comport ourselves as Jews as opposed to what our genetic background is.
I see.
And there are a lot of rabbis, obviously, in this world today that really want Judaism to be determined by what your genetic background is. And that it seems to me that as a beginner, that Torah has both in great quantity. And it's frustrating to me that so far that the rabbis seem to be doing these backflips to attach Judaism to some sort of genetic heritage, and there's some worth that is attached to this and that and this kind of genetic. They're picking and choosing their genetics and traits and making it all fit. But ultimately, the box is a genetic box as opposed to a cultural box. And
so I don't know if everybody heard that. If people online, can you all hear that? Yeah? You did. So I think, I'll answer first, and then maybe if you want to, Rabbi Kosh, maybe Rabbi Dana will also say something. But I would say that I actually love that the rabbis are dancing on the head of a pin, because what they're doing is they're dancing that way because there's tension for them, as there is for us too, right? My son doesn't have to be like an Ingber to be my son. He has my genetic material, and he also is an Ingber. He can act un-Ingber-esque, and so can I. But we hold that. But people can marry into my family, God willing, at one point. And so we have a process by which a person, like in country, can be born a citizen of the country by virtue of their birth and live here, and also become a citizen, right? Naturalized. And so conversion in the rabbinic mind is a form of democratizing or allowing there to be permeable boundaries. But I think the rabbis are dancing on the head of a pin because they're struggling with both the moral imperative to not hold a grudge, the moral imperative to to not exclude someone because of something that happened before, to not exclude them for any other reason because the person before you is the person before you. And what we get to witness, because the rabbis wrote this down for posterity, is the rabbinic struggle with burgeoning mores and ethical mores that are themselves developing. The rabbis are developing within time, and the text of Torah is static. So how do the rabbis relate to a static text as life and God and Torah and everything evolves? And so they're kind of like doing the splits, ethically speaking. Like you watch them splitting, and their flexibility becomes their nimble mind being able to work within a text that itself is canonical. So rabbis can't come along the way the reform movement came along and say like, oh, this part we'll just do away with it, right? And so they had to find a way to make a moral and ethical point, and they do it, I think, stunningly, even if it's laborious for some of us who might more easily just take a pen and say, oh, that, I don't keep that. That's kind of like, that's not for me. And the rabbis have no such recourse. And so what they do is they do this beautiful, this dance that they do, which allows them to hold on to the text and also help it evolve as well to keep up with where things are going. And so that's what, I don't know what you would. Move on from that, yeah. So I'm sympathetic though. Trust me, I dropped out of more than one rabbinical school because I didn't want to continue to spend all of my time in the casuistry and the pilpul of Talmud. But yeah, it's kind of like minutia, that kind of thing. The sophistry.
I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
All the rabbis that I know accept converts. So they're none of them are based in a genetic understanding of what Judaism is. The only community in the world that I know that doesn't accept converts is the one I come from, the Syrian Jews, which is completely anomalous. Which means that, practically the entire Jewish world does not base its understanding of who the Jews are in genetics solely.
And by the way, what's remarkable,
it's a crucial part of Jewish law.
And what's remarkable about the notion that there wouldn't be some kind of conversion or some kind of process of is that you're right, it would then place an emphasis on civilization and on culture. But in places like Israel, let's say, for example, or in other places where there is no religious core, but there's just, let's say, Judaism as a culture, they rely heavily on being born a Jew to establish like your relationship with that civilization. And what happens is when you don't have when you wind up placing it only on doing Jewishly, it winds up ironically becoming more like a catechism in the church, where you can be born a Christian, but you have to accept Christianity as part of the belief system. What would you then say to someone? How does someone become Jewish? Or what makes them Jewish is that they hold a certain belief, or that they're kind of Judeophiles, they like Judaism, or so I think that holding both of those places, which is there's a way to be Jewish even if you don't do Jewish, is vital. There's a way to do Jewish even if you're not a Jew, but you can still do Jewish and be a part of a Jewish community. And to hold those things in tension, I think it's not easy, but I think that's kind of my answer to your important question. Okay, so we have any other people in the room?
Just very briefly, some coincidences. It is a weekend of loyalty for those of us who are British. The involuntary grief and surprising maternal grief at the death of the Queen, and I'm astonished at how much it affected me. But there are some mass coincidences because because you think of the Queen as the most English person there is, but amongst the highest ranks of British aristocracy, she's called the German, because her family, the Hanoverian family, which they reached out to some obscure German princes in the beginning of the 18th century because they needed a Protestant. So they just went through the family tree and they were like, oh, there's some German cousins over there, we'll bring them in. But the King George I didn't speak English, he was German. And so this family is sort of illegitimate, like David.
Wow.
And
It wasn't just Diana.
no, they're in England, there are old believers who are like, oh yeah, the Germans. And they had to change the family name in World War I to Windsor.
Wow.
A super German name. And you know, I mean, it's a very strange story.
So
But
the purest family of all.
yeah,
is
they're
pure.
actually looked down on as outsiders, the British royal family, by British aristocrats. So just like David, the seeming ultimate insider is this outsider. And just two thoughts on that there is a theory of monarchy that I was just reading about that says at the heart of legitimacy is illegitimacy. That in order to be truly legitimate, you had to have illegitimacy in your lineage. And so the crown was stolen, or it should have gone to your brother, or this, that, and the other. And every narrative of legitimacy depends on like a pearl depending on a grain of sand, the seed of illegitimacy, which I think is interesting. And lastly,
I want you to just keep going. But everybody come back to the pearl in a grain of sand idea. Okay, so go ahead.
The pearl is the legitimacy, but the grain of sand is the illegitimacy because the crown is always stolen or borrowed or deflected. And this theory was established in some ways to support the Germans. And then lastly, just it's an irresistible coincidence that when this German came in, George I, they had to invent new rituals to kind of say, okay, well, actually, he's not descended from Athelstan and the Middle Ages, but we still are king. And one of the new rituals was a new liturgy, which was about Zadok the priest, the high priest of the temple, the Jewish priest, which is a really weird thing in England. And there's this liturgy where they invoke Zadok, who supposedly anointed Solomon or anointed David, I forget exactly, but it's one of the early texts of anointing. And especially that act of, not the crown, but the oil.
And that proves you could anoint an illegitimate.
Yeah. So this week, when Charles goes through his mikvah, as it were, the name of Zadok, strangely, this priest of the Jewish temple, will be invoked and like will be part of the legitimizing of this monarch. And so somehow, like the insider and the outsider, the ultra Protestant with this like Jewish priest from however long ago actually plays a role, and his name is evoked. That means a lot to me as someone between Englishness and Judaism.
I can't help but think, and we're going to go to Beth, because Beth set her hand up, and we have to go to Beth, and we can come back into the room. But I can't help but think through what Thomas was saying is that I think that what Rabbi Kolorasis and I were both saying and reading here is that in terms of tshuva, in terms of the overall sweep of where we are in the calendar, there's a certain illegitimacy that feels like, who am I to be who I am, or who am I to make a claim that I can change, or who am I to make any claim, right? During the U.S. Open now, there's a kind of this great storyline of this TFO, Francis TFO, this incredible, ended his run apparently yesterday. I didn't see the end of the match, but like came out of nowhere, lost in the semifinal to another up and rising star. But like his story was really captivating because again, he comes from, like he came out of nowhere. Like his father worked in Maryland at a local tennis club as one of the as a contractor there, and he kind of grew up and they discovered him. It was like a King David story. Like they discovered him hitting a ball against the wall, and someone saw that he had talent, and he was the least of them, right? And like the way King David was the least of them. He was the smallest, right? And there's something about the entire conversation about in the Jewish tradition about the monarch coming from humble places. And one of the things I said about the queen frequently was that she was quite, with everything, she was, many of the anecdotes were about her humility and about how she had a kind of sense of humor that could laugh at herself, but, and so it's kind of remarkable to hear that King David, of course, is in our tradition, the greatest Baal Tshuva, the one who made some of the biggest mistakes and also made some of the most public expressions of humbling himself.
To bring this down to the ground, in terms of Tomas's point, is maybe we all have the imposter syndrome from King David
All the way down.
on down,
All the
from
way
the
down.
queen on, and we all think we're illegitimate. Whoa, that's really liberating, at least for me.
So go to Beth. Yeah.
Shabbat Shalom. I have two comments. One has to do with all the mental gymnastics that the rabbis have done in response to a static text. We are rationalizing beings, and we go through life rationalizing our own behavior, rationalizing what goes on around us. And so I think that the rabbis, just like me and all of you, would probably have gone through some sort of mental gymnastics, no matter what the text was, whether it was static or not. That's one point. The other point I wanted to make with regard to Tomas's remarks about the British monarchy, it's so interesting to me, the pomp, the circumstance, the gold braid, the medals, blah, 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 the whole infrastructure around someone becoming king of England, as opposed to what happened with me. I'm a Jew by choice, and the way I became Jewish is by taking everything off and going to the mikveh and making a solemn vow. And I don't denigrate at all Charles's vow, but you don't have to have the braid on to do it. You can be completely naked when you do it. Just saying. Debarti.
We have a lot of comments, but we only have a couple of minutes. So maybe we can just read the last two texts and then leave all of you to have a really wonderful conversation about the remainder of the time. Source number 9 and then source number 10. And
I think, well, let's just do the beginning briefly, because it says, okay, so we're in source 9. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana B'tach Rizun Ba'al Tachta'u. So the rabbis are quoting here in the Midrash on the book of Ruth, Psalms 4, which says, tremble and do not sin. That's where Rizun is tremble, but okay. Amar David B'fen HaKadosh Baruch Hu, King David said before the Holy One was today, Ad Eimatai Hem Mitravizim Alai Ba'omrim Lo Isu Mishpachahu. So Lo Isu Mishpachahu. So David's saying, like, until when are they gonna keep, like, making fun of me or teasing me or provoking me and saying, this guy doesn't have a legitimate family, right? Isn't Velone Ruth HaMoabiah? So isn't he from the line of Ruth the Moabite? So because of this, this flawed, lineage, everyone's making fun of him, right? They're teasing him or they're bullying him. Now the end of this is really interesting. So I'm down at Rabbi Berachia and Rabbi Simon towards the end of the same source. Mashal Lamelach, Shaya Over Mimakom Lamakom, Vinachla Margarit Lake Al. So there's an analogy to a king who would pass from place to place, and a pearl fell from the ground on his head. Mat HaMelech, B'chol Pamalia Shalosh Sham. So he stood in his whole entourage there. V'hayu Omrim V'shavim Omrim Ma Tivo Shamelech B'chol Pamalia Shalom Kan. Ra'u Amru Naflo So the king and his entire entourage stop there, and passersby would say, "What's the nature of the Why is the king standing there?" The king is entourage standing there. So they saw and said, "A pearl fell from upon his head." What did he do? Ma'asa sabar ta'afar v'hidi machzorot v'chavar et hatzibur ha'achad v'lo mitzah. He piled up the dirt and brought sifters and sifted one pile but did not find it. The second did not find it, and the third he found it. So this is a mashal. This is an allegory. Is that a good parable? Thank you. Good. A parable for what God does. HaKadosh Baruch Hu amar la'Abraham, lech lecha hayiti mitzapeh. So in this way, God said to Abraham, "Go forth. You are the one I was waiting for. Not sorach hayalu liacheshan, apachshad, shelach, eber, peled, nahor, terach, ela bishvilcha." So God is kind of sifting through the generations, all these people who are not notable, until God gets to Abraham. So the same thing is true of David's genealogy. Matzata et levavo ne'aman panecha, kach amar hakadosh baruch hu yidadu. Matzorach haya li liaches Peres, Ketron, Ram, Aminadab, Nachshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Yishai, Lo b'shvilcha. Oh, sorry, Lo b'shvilcha, Matzati, David, Adi. So God is sifting through this whole genealogy, and then the Holy One, God says to David, "What need was there for me to delineate Peretz, Ketron, Ram, Aminadab, Nachshon, Obed, Yishai? Was it not for you? I have found my servant." So God is the king who sifts through the sand.
But the sand is inside the pearl. Pearl is in sand, but the sand is inside the pearl.
Right. The sand generates the pearl. Okay.
It's just like the sense that a lineage, which is kind of a tale of generational, names, that in some sense, the very thing that King David wanted was a lineage. The very thing that King David wanted was to be able to say at the end of the book of Boaz, at the end of the book of Ruth, like, I'm from there, that's where I'm from. And then the end of the Midrash says, you're so worried about what people are saying about you, but guess what? The lineage isn't what you think it is. The lineage, it was about you. It was always about you. I chose you because you're unique. And all of those names, right, were there in order to are necessary, right? Because you come from there. It's required. But I was looking for you. I would have found you, right? Like the sense that each person might be able to say that no matter where I came from, the fact that I am awake at this moment, the fact that I am awake enough to say that I'm being deployed, that's like a very powerful image here. Like you're being deployed. Like it's not like it won't matter. Like you think about the lineage. It's almost like the Midrash is coming to tell King David, stop worrying about what everybody's telling you, right? God sees you. God sees you. And God saw you from the beginning. It's like it was for you, Abraham.
Your interpretation is more beautiful than the text, because the text turns the lineage into sand and David only into the pearl. Right? But you're saying, in a way, God is saying to each of us, we're pearls that we're selected from. God has sifted through, and here's the pearl at this moment.
Right, and what Thomas was saying too is that every pearl, of course, there's a paradox, of course, that you might have come from sand, but sand makes a pearl. Like the sand is in the pearl, and the pearl is in the sand. It's like when God dropped it in the sand, God brought it all together because it was discernible. You could see the pearl when you see it in the sand, right? The same way, like knowing about this guy, Tiafo's, where he came from, is a vital component of what makes his story incredible. But it's also part of what made him incredible, right? So maybe Davka, we needed Ruth to come from Moab. It's not that King David's you want to know that you were part of the, the very thing that they were criticizing will become the greatness that you are, because you yourself will know what it's like to come from sand, because all of us do.
But isn't that like regrets and vows? When we talked about regrets and vows, and each one of us is doing a shiva around the sand and the pearl within ourselves, and the vow with Hashem as we go to the holidays.
Yeah.
Each one of us is in this journey.
So the last text that we were gonna study, which is on your sheet, which again, it's kind of a beautiful text, but we've been pretty far afield from where it is. But it's kind of a good one to keep in your pocket. That there's a great rabbi in Israel named Rabbi Nebenzahl. Abigdor Nebenzahl wrote that if there's a spiritual defect, and again, we can actually extract the pearl from this sand, which is that chesed, the world is built on kindness and goodness, and that a little bit of kindness goes a long way. And had, right, in his mind, the great sin of Moab and Ammon, which we hear of unpacked more profoundly, is that they weren't generous at a time when others needed them. And so I think that there's a lot here about generosity and about what it is to feed each other and go again.
No, and the implication of not only generosity, but the other end, which is how do we respond to vulnerability and need? Like how do, what do we close our hearts to?
Which is very true, Nick. Like, at this time of the year, I'm just going to say last thing about this. It was very personally meaningful, this teaching, because I think that it was beautiful to see, and again, notwithstanding Beth and notwithstanding what Paul said, I think it was very beautiful for me to see the rabbis struggling so much to hold the Torah to its own values of not holding a grudge against someone who did something 10 generations ago or 20 generations ago. I think it's a very difficult one. This week I had a chance to teach for a group of Christians who are studying forgiveness, and they're studying it by reading a lot of Jewish texts and other texts, but they just read Elie Wiesel's Night, and they were going through Holocaust literature, and they were asking these really big questions about forgiveness for Nazis and forgiveness for Germans, forgiveness for those who have done things to us. And I think, without stepping into a huge topic, that there's just like the notion that the Torah recognized that even though Ammon and Moab were not kind, and that we are to learn to be kind, especially when people are vulnerable, there's a way that the Jewish people have a certain prophetic inspiration, and Ruth became the possibility of forgiveness, of people being able to turn over a new leaf and not judging them for what might have been where they were like last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And that's just an incredibly salient motif for all of us. And I wonder if it's possible, because I think that tshuva can't get off the ground unless we really believe people can change. If somebody asks you at 3 o'clock in the morning, can people change? And your response is no, then the tshuva doesn't get out the gate. And the fact that the Torah itself changes to meet people where they are is like it's amazing. The Torah.
It reminds me of Walt Whitman, who's sad about himself, but I feel like the Torah could say this about herself. Like, do I contradict myself? No, I contain multitudes. I contain multitudes. But the Torah is full of contradictions. And the rabbis have a field day because how could sacred scripture have contradiction for that? That's what they're on. That's the sand for their quills.
Exactly. So anyway, so now it's 9:54. I have to run inside, but
I can stay for a few minutes.
Rabbi Kolesh is going to